Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining the first of what I hope will be an annual event to mark the birthday of Ralph Waldo Emerson and to honor a man who perhaps did more than anyone in his or her lifetime in bringing Emerson's life and scholarship to our present moment, the late Robert Richardson. The museum is proud to co-sponsor this event in partnership with the Ralph Waldo Emerson Memorial Association and with the full support of Bob Richardson's family, many of whom are watching tonight. I hope it not inappropriate to begin with two confessions. They connect to our topic, I promise. I often suffer from insomnia, and last week found myself awake at 3 a.m. in the morning, furiously preparing for a different forum in conjunction with our new temporary exhibit. As I was writing out my questions, I received an alert about an incoming email. Who on earth, I thought, could be writing me at this hour of the day? It turns out it was from one of the many daily e-blasts I receive, this one from a group called gratefulness.org that sends me a quote to begin my day to remind me of my many blessings and how I hope to live my life. Procrastinator that I am, even at that pre-dawn hour, I turned from my forum preparation to peruse the day's missive, which read, quote, "Guard well your spare moments. They are like uncut diamonds. Discard them and their value will never be known. Improve them and they will become the brightest gems in a useful life." And like a Dickensian scene from the Christmas Carol, the author of those words, which is why I'm telling the story tonight, was Ralph Waldo Emerson, the ghost of Concord past, chiding me to go back to sleep, to guard well my spare moments, to protect those diamonds through which gleams a useful and productive life. My second confession is that when I first took this job, I knew very little about Concord's history, the Revolutionary War, or the likes of Emerson or Thoreau. For the latter, I turned to the biographies of Bob Richardson. And having been enchanted and enriched by them, I wrote to Bob to invite him to speak here. He agreed, and his brother David drove him up from the Cape in what would turn out to be one of Bob's last public appearances. He gave a talk that summer evening titled Upstream with the Transcendentalists, a portion of which you will hear as part of tonight's program. My second source of information was to listen to a program organized by tonight's primary speaker, Richard Geldard, that was held at Faneuil Hall to help mark the bicentennial of Emerson's birth. I've asked my colleague Allison to put a link to that program, the video of it, which includes Robert Pinsky reading selected excerpts carefully chosen by Dr. Geldard. So it'll be in the chat feature. If you are interested, you can listen to that program as well after this one. And I was also determined to invite Richard to speak here at the museum, which brings us to this very special occasion. I'll introduce Richard in a moment, but I wanted to read one quote of Louisa May Alcott's from Richard's opening words that evening on the Emerson Bicentennial, which connect our event here in Concord to the museum's current temporary exhibit on the women of Concord. After listening to Ralph Waldo Emerson speak one night in Boston, Louisa May Alcott wrote the following in her journal, quote, "When Faneuil Hall used to be the scene of riot and danger in anti-slavery days, I remember sitting tip aloft, an excited girl among the loyal women who never failed to be there, and how they always looked for that serene face on the platform and found fresh courage at the mere sight of the wisest man in America." She was referring, of course, to Ralph Waldo Emerson. So let's begin this special evening with video clips from Bob Richardson's remarks during the summer of 2019, speaking in our new Lyceum space. We'll also watch another video clip from Bob at the end of tonight's program. His words will be followed by an excerpt of the remarks that Bay Emerson Bancroft, one of Ralph Waldo Emerson's direct heirs, offered that evening. So let's watch this first clip.
Yes.
Window and said to his friends, "We must attend to." One day, Emerson and his friends were sitting in his living room in Concord talking about truth, beauty, good, and evil, when when a wagon load of firewood arrived and was dumped noisily into the yard. Emerson stood up, looked out the window, and said to his friends, "We must attend to these logs as though they were real." On
The
another
sound is not coming in very
part of the
well.
conversation he just had,
This is Bob
good
Richardson
friend and neighbor,
talking
practical and high-flown Bronson
just before his death.
in March of 1869. Alcott came, talked Plato and Socrates, extolling them with gravity. I bore it long, and then said that was a song for others, not for him. I told him to shut his eyes and let his thoughts run into reverie whithersoever, and then take an observation. And he would find that the current went outward from man, not to man. Consciousness was upstream. Love that. Call it consciousness or call it light. It's in us. And in the early 1980s, a latter-day transcendentalist scientist, if I may call him that, Carl Sagan, noted that all the elements of which you and I are made, everything that is above helium in the periodic table, were synthesized in the cores of past stars that went supernova and spewed the elements into space. Sagan's conclusion still raises the hair on the back of my neck. We are a way for the universe to know itself. Some part of us knows this is true, this is where we came from, and we long to return, and we can, because the cosmos is also within us. We are made of star stuff.
Bob, it's so very, very good to have you back here in Concord on this refulgent summer evening. Noting that the museum's own David Wood is one of us also. He's also an Emerson trustee. I bring you greetings and best wishes and thanks from all of us at that house across the turnpike. Thanks for all you have written so fully and freshly and originally about the thinking man who lived there. Back in 2003, the bicentennial year of Emerson's birth, many noted Emerson scholars, fans, and critics weighed in via all the media that were available back then 16 years ago. Of all the many and diverse voices that I heard and read that year, for me, it was Bob's that stole the show. He gave the key talk at the First Parish Church in Concord on May 25th. That was actually Emerson's 200th birthday. A singular talk, for it was alive with his own ideas, speculations, and questions. Ideas and questions that Emerson's life and ideas had generated in Richardson's own life and work. Great, sometimes complex, provocative, hopeful ideas. See what he just said now about transcendentalism. Since then, I've come to look up to Bob himself as a representative man, a new thinking man for our times, cast in the mold of the remarkable people to whose work he has been drawn, but then proceeding to crack or break the mold as they all did in their time. He's a rare guy.
So again, for anyone joining late, those were a couple of clips from an event here in 2019. Richard, I'm about to introduce you, but we muted you. So while I'm doing the introduction, you have to figure out, I think, on your computer, how to unmute yourself. If you move your cursor, you should see something that says mute, and if you hit it, it'll help you to unmute yourself. Let me do the introduction. Our speaker this evening is Richard Geldard, a distinguished author of numerous books, including The Traveler's Key to Sacred Places of Ancient Greece, which, in his words, was his effort to bring the ideas of idealism front and center in a serious challenge to materialism, which, he writes, led to other books on Emerson's idealism and a series on pre-Socratic philosophy. With an undergraduate degree from Bowdoin and his doctorate from Stanford, he also benefited from studies at Breadloaf in Vermont, where he studied Emerson under the prodigious Harold Bloom, who recounted a story involving a cocktail hour conversation Bloom once had with then Yale president Bart Giamatti, who asked Bloom how his Emerson class was going. Fine, Bloom replied, but I wish people would stop thinking of Emerson as sweet. Sweet, Giamatti exclaimed. Emerson's about as sweet as barbed wire. Richard's comments tonight emanate, I understand, most directly from his book, Emerson and the Universal Mind, which none other than Bob Richardson describes as a brilliant, forceful, cogent, eloquent, and personal brief for this essential validity of the great Neoplatonic doctrine of ideas and a wholly believable effort to put Emerson firmly in that tradition. It is, although Richard and I spoke right beforehand, and he may have adjusted his comments slightly to fit our audience. So it is now my honor to welcome Richard Geldard to share the inaugural Robert Richardson Lecture here on this virtual Concord stage. Richard.
Thank you, Tom. Are you hearing me?
We are, yep.
Good. Thank you. I did find the unmute just in time.
Good.
I want to start with a somber note, which is that this day, which is Emerson's birthday, is also the first anniversary of the death of George Lloyd in Minneapolis. And I mention it because Concord, from the early days before the Civil War, was part of the Underground Railroad, helping escaped slaves north into Canada, Vermont, Maine, New Hampshire. And Thoreau would rush the fleeing slave or slaves from his cabin in the 2 years and 2 months that he lived there, or his mother's house, and they would get to Emerson's barn where they would hitch up the horse and buggy, and off they would go into the murky night. And it was obviously a very important intellectual and physical and emotional time when those, and then of course when the terrible law that made helping a escaped slave a crime, it caused Emerson a series of terrible fits of anger. And it indicates that the difficulty that we're having now in this country has a long, long history. So that said, I want to say something, if I may, about the founding of this amazing, amazing village, which I know is now perhaps a commuting town, but at the same time, also a place where many famous people have lived and worked. So we begin the story in 1635 with the founding of the town by Peter Buckley, who was a minister in England, and he was fired from his post for a failure to obey the instructions of his superiors in his work. And so he was fired. And fortunately for him, there was money there. And along with some of the wealthier people in his parish, they decided to emigrate. And So they did so, and they made, of course, an arrangement with the native tribe, which lived where the town is now, and they began to prepare for this journey. Now, one of the details that is, I think, interesting that many people did not know, and that is that in one of the many books that Samuel Eliot Morison wrote about early America, he told the story of a squirrel in a tree near Plymouth Rock, frightened by the sound of singing pilgrims as they came ashore, and he jumped from one tree to another and was able to do so all the way to Chicago without touching the ground, giving you an idea, in fact, of the struggle that Peter and the dozen families that came with him, they had to cut trees down. They had to move, obviously, wagons of equipment, belongings, household items, and so on. They had to do all of that. And it took 6 weeks to go 18 miles from Cambridge to the town site, where they built their first log cabins. And it wasn't for 20 years before they were able to cut boards to build real houses. But nonetheless, that was the beginning. And it always has struck me that the character of the town was in fact established as a result of that effort. You could say pessimistically that it was the ego of Buckley, who didn't want any interference in his choice of how to lead worship. But I think it's much more a matter of being concerned about what was going on in America, in towns like Salem and so on, in which there was a good deal of religious conflict, witches being shunted off or hanged, and so on, that we all know about. In fact, some of them were Emerson's relatives. He mentions, in fact, at one point that one of his relatives was a woman who was banished from Salem, and the person who banished her, the judge, was also a relation of the Emerson family. So anyway, the town was established with great pride, I think, in its unique being the first and for a long time the only non-seawater village in Massachusetts, even though they were only 18 miles inland. So that began that feel for the town, and it drew people. And the more you read the histories, which are the wonderful books on the history of Concord, as you can imagine, and there are wonderful stories about the relationship with the natives, and then how that soured and became conflict, and the army came in and took the natives away and put them on islands and so on. But the growth of the town was such that it was an indication of the spirit that Concord would reflect and project for up right till now. And it's a feeling. And one of the things that I know your own personal experience right now has not been long, but I think you'll feel it, Tom, as time goes along. You'll feel that sense of pride and I mean, I've been in Concord many times. I came up to the the Thoreau meetings most of the time, which is where I would encounter Bob Richardson, and we would often sit in the lounge at the hotel with a gin and tonic and talk about books and so on. And on one occasion, which I remember, he told me the story of receiving a letter from Annie Dillard praising his Thoreau book. And this was while he's beginning to work on the Emerson, and how she praised him, and he wrote back and thanked her, and particularly praised Pilgrim on Tinker Creek, which had just won a Pulitzer Prize. And at the end of the letter, he said, what are you doing for the rest of your life? And she wrote back with a comment, fairly brief comment, what did you have in mind? And a year later, they were married. So I've often thought of that as such a wonderful story. And it's part of their character, and I think I trust. And it's been so sad in this last year when she was having memory difficulties and had to stop writing. And of course, Annie had this habit of having a little hut somewhere on the Oregon coast or up on the Cape, and down in Virginia where Tinker Creek was, or still is. So what I was doing at the time when I finished my graduate work, I was doing my work on pre-Socratic Greek philosophers, and Anaxagoras being the major one, who was living in 500 BCE, living on what is now the Turkish border. I mean, in little Greek towns that the Persians were happy to keep there because of the trade moving from Greece to the Orient. And the result was that Anaxagoras was hired by the family of Pericles to come and tutor the boy. And he was the first philosopher to enter Athens, which was a very religious city. Every 3 days was a religious holiday of one sort or another. And Anaxagoras managed to infuse the entire intellectual center of Athens with this notion that mind ran the universe. Nous was the Greek word for mind. And so as I finished up this work, which I was doing with T.B.L. Webster, who was a brilliant, brilliant man who came to Stanford for the year that before I got there, and the year after I left, he died. And somehow I was able to work with him, who had written at least 25 books on 5th century Athens. And I got a job in New York City at the collegiate school, which coincidentally was founded in 1635 and was the first school in America, although it's an argument that they have with Harvard's, the School for Boys at Harvard. It'll come to me as I'm speaking, I hope. But in any case, here I was in this school, and which was a boys' school and a very, very good one. And I met this young man who was extremely brilliant, who is now my stepson, who went on to Yale and got his PhD in neuroscience. And his mother was her husband and Kent's father passed away, and I was unattached at the time, and we married. I had a daughter at exactly the same time. The point of this diversion is to say that she introduced me to the School of Philosophy in New York, which is on the east side, near the Museum of Natural History. And I was asked to teach a course in Emerson because the school loved Emerson, taught Emerson, had classes in Emerson. I was not versed in Emerson at all, and I had to teach this course, which I did at 6:30 on Wednesday mornings to a group of very, very interesting people. And one of whom, incidentally, as a footnote, was one of the children in Schindler's List, who at the end of the movie, if you saw Schindler's List, came down the slope to put a rock on Schindler's coffin. And I suddenly was sitting there saying, oh my God, he's in my class. But anyway, the gist of this is that was my introduction to Emerson. And it really caught hold strongly. And I started working on preparing work. And what was important to me at the time was that I was mature. I was in my 40s when this happened. And I'm glad I didn't get started to Emerson too soon. It takes a mature person to read Emerson well and to follow his line of thought and his focus. And so those particular facts, I hope, indicate something of where I was coming from. And my wife is a very well-known and successful artist, and we bought a house up here in the Hudson Valley, and also had an apartment in New York, and we went back and forth on weekends until we finally gave up New York and are now here, both of us in our 80s, carrying on with this epidemic that we're having. So what I'd like to do I?
Yeah, have a few more minutes. I
minutes?
know you're going to talk a little bit about Emerson and nature, and then just recount a couple of stories about Emerson's travels.
Yes. There are two things that most people don't know about Emerson and his travels, and one of which is first, when the Continental Railroad was finished, in which Leland Stanford was the CEO of the West Coast, they met in Wyoming or Utah or somewhere along there. And when it was finished, Mr. Pullman invited Emerson and friends to go to the West Coast, which Emerson would love to do, but didn't want to go around South America on a ship to get to California. But the idea of this beautiful car that was beautifully outfitted for them a group of about a dozen people that were in this car. And they went out to San Francisco, did carriage rides up back east a little bit, and then on horseback got into Yosemite. And Yosemite, suddenly there was this whispering going on around Yosemite. Emerson is here. Emerson is here. And at the same time that was happening, John Muir was a young man running a sawmill, building houses, and built the hotel that was there. So Emerson was staying at the hotel, and Muir, who had every book and anything that Emerson had ever written in his library, which was up a tree in a, and John Muir went down to a talk, and he stood in the back of the room. And when other people went up to greet Emerson, he didn't dare move away from the wall. But he wrote a note saying that the mountain, one of the mountains, had welcomed him there, and he hoped he would stay for several days, signed John Muir. And Emerson the next morning showed this to one of the guys and said, "Where is this Muir person?" He went down there, and Emerson is 67, I think, at that point. I'm sure it can be corrected. And managed to scramble up the walk, little ladder to this tree house to look at Muir's books. And Muir took him up into the great trees, and Emerson named one of the biggest trees, one of the biggest redwoods, called Samoset, which was the name of one of the chiefs of the tribe that was there at Concord, Samoset. And so that's that story. And 10 years later, there was a fire in Emerson's house because a maid tipped over a lamp, and they had to leave, but Thoreau had been smart, and he had arranged Emerson's library so that everything was parked in boxes with handles on. And they got out, all of the books out onto the lawn, saved the house. The town raised $5,000 to send he and his daughter Ellen to Egypt. Now that was a very interesting trip, although he was older in his 70s, and he was very frustrated because they hadn't been able to translate the hieroglyphics on all the monuments. So Emerson was deeply frustrated. But there was a boat going up the Nile, which was a wonderful trip. And at one point, they were anchored, and he looked out over, and here was one of the most beautiful temples in Egypt. And he said, "I would really like to go visit that temple." And a little 10-year-old boy standing next to him on the deck and said, "I'll take you, Mr. Emerson." And he did, and the little boy was Theodore Roosevelt, whose family was also on this journey to Egypt that summer. So those are two stories about toward the end of Emerson's life, A very wonderful trip out to California and this trip to Egypt. And the rumor is that Emerson stood in front of the Sphinx at one point, and Ellen reported that he said, "Ah, you too."
I should note to our viewers that if you have questions, put them in the chat room. I may just ask Richard one or two questions, and then we have another treat with another clip from
Okay.
Bob Richardson. But I mean, from my interactions with you, Richard, I know just this notion of the examined life has been central to your own thinking about your own life and your scholarship. And I wanted to read one quote of yours and one of Emerson's to just have you comment. So at Faneuil Hall, at a session called Emerson and the Examined Life, these are your words. We learn to listen seriously to ourselves in the light of thought. We learn to give our attention to the act of reflection as it takes place in the mind. And we even learn to throw out those uninvited thoughts that blunder into our precious solitude. We then allow ourselves to examine the reflections that bubble up from the well springs of our experience, from that source of mind that without reflection would otherwise remain hidden from us. It's a very Emersonian image that you create there for us. And then you noted that in Self-Reliance, what Emerson wrote is, quote, "Nothing at last is sacred, but the integrity of your own mind." Maybe just a comment about why the examined life has been such an important theme in your own life.
Well, I guess what I'd like in this context to say about that is that the examined life takes discipline and effort, which means that it's very, very good to have some guidance. And in the School of Philosophy, where we were for a decade, we learned the art of meditation, and we learned how to sit, how to breathe. It is something that I still do. It stills the mind, and it's after a while, after some effort, real effort, the crazy stuff doesn't bubble up anymore, and it can grow quiet. And in that quiet, there comes occasionally an original thought, something that has the integrity of not being something that is repeated from someone else, like quoting Emerson. And I tend in lectures, to try to be as original as I can and not say, well, Emerson said, and Emerson said, and Emerson said, because people can read Emerson. And earlier you had written me about a question about Emerson is saying that in making the effort to keep the mind quiet enough for genuine thought, original thought can emerge, is like trying to swim up
Niagara Falls.
And my comment was, well, I have never reached, I don't think, that point myself, but I've stood in the mist.
Yes.
And the mist gives you it pelts you like little pieces of glass, but at least you can stand it,
right?
And so there are obviously degrees of originality and authenticity in our thoughts, which allows us to write without being seen as somebody's assistant, that kind of
Right,
thing.
yeah,
It
yeah.
allows us some possibility of an original thought.
It reminds me of two things. One, Bob Richardson's wonderful book, First We Read, Then We Write,
Yes.
in which he talks about that there is the double process of bringing information in, but then the original ideas come to us and then we write those. And what you just said is somewhat similar to what Bay was referring to in her video, in that she was remembering, and I think you were there too, at the bicentennial event here at the first, I think it was at the First Parish Church. Bay was suggesting that others gave interesting recitations of Emerson's work, but Bob was the only one, I think he did something dramatic, like,
Well,
clear.
yeah, could I say just something about that quickly?
Yeah, please do.
He and I were standing in the back of the church just before he went up to give the keynote for that event. And he said, watch, I'm going to do something a little outrageous. And I said, okay. And he gave this image of all of the various religious traditions and so on being chess pieces on the board. And then he swept his hand across the board and knocked them all down from the pulpit of the first church on the hill.
Yeah.
And I didn't hear any gasps in the audience, because this was not the regular congregation.
Right.
There were other people sitting in the Emerson pit, So but that was daring of him to do that. I mean, he just wiped his hand off. And essentially what he was saying was in his talk is that we have to begin to think about a conscious universe and let go of the pearly gates and this notion of heaven as a gated community.
Right. Yeah.
With St. Peter at the gate saying, hello, and your name is?
And a few elect.
Right.
Well, Richard, this has been lovely. I'm going to end with another, first, a lovely exchange with Bob's brother, David, who actually drove Bob to Concord. They both had spent years here in their teenage years living in Concord, and so it was a bit of a homecoming. And at the end of the forum, David extemporaneously stood up and said a few words of tribute to his brother. And then I'm going to give the penultimate word to Bob. We have a nice clip of kind of the conclusion of Bob's remarks that night, in which he actually quotes his wife, Annie Dillard. And then I'll come back on and I'm going to give the last word to Ralph Waldo Emerson, fittingly. So let's roll these clips now.
I look forward to that.
Great.
Thank you.
I can't add anything that will challenge your thinking and your knowledge of the subject. But I just wanted to say, I'm Rob's younger brother, and trust me, it wasn't I that brought him up. But I will tell you that my wife, my children, his children, my nieces, everybody feels that this fellow is one of the kindest, most caring, most thoughtful, and most steady family member and leader of a proud family that reveres him. And I just wanted to toss that in our top.
And some part of each of us longs to be inside the light, to work upstream against the flow, to arrive at the source and know it for what it is, even if just for a moment. I remember one such. It was the last day of October, 1992. I was living in Middletown, Connecticut. We were having a glorious autumn. It was early evening and I was walking up the street toward our house. The street was lined with silver maples. They were still young, maybe 30 years old, but they had reached their full shapes. And all the leaves on every tree were a bright, glowing, waxy yellow. It's a common enough sight in a New England autumn, although I am quite sure that I would never have noticed it, except that I had read and loved the great second chapter of Annie Dillard's Pilgrim at Tinker Creek, which ends with the vision of the Tree of Lights, and which is the best piece of writing on the art of seeing that I know. There was not a scrap of red or brown or green on those trees in that street in Middletown. Every leaf was a golden yellow. No wind stirred. It was still daytime, but it was the last moment of daytime, and the leaves seemed to have gathered in the sun's light and were now holding it as the street and the town stood still on the edge of evening. Walking under each tree was like walking into a lantern, into the light itself. The light held you and made you forget for a moment just what urgent errand you were on. You stood still, took a deep breath, and lived in the light for a moment. If I believed in grace, I would call it grace. But I want to emphasize what a small, unimportant little moment it was. No life-changing, world-shaking vision, not at all. It was only a minor, non-alcoholic, off-ramp, fat-free, unleaded sort of homemade grace. But small as it was real. Some law, some instinct, some knowledge called me into those warm, bright yellow trees, and I could still feel the light. Maybe.
So let me conclude this evening by once again thanking Richard Geldart and quoting Ralph Waldo Emerson, though as Richard told us, Emerson himself would want us not to just be quoting him, but to having our own original thoughts in our own way. But Ralph Waldo Emerson cautioned us to not sleepwalk through our days, and instead to see the world through our own eyes and to measure events and persons through our own values. Bob Richardson has given us a living example of looking for the miraculous in the ordinary as we determine each morning what we shall do with the day before us. So listen now to these words from Ralph Waldo Emerson from his essay, Experience. We must be very suspicious of the deceptions of the element of time. I'll repeat that. We must be very suspicious of the deceptions of the element of time. It takes a good deal of time to eat or to sleep or to earn $100, and a very little time to entertain a hope and an insight which becomes the light of our life. We dress our garden, eat our dinners, discuss the household with our spouses, and these things make no impression, are forgotten next week. But in the solitude to which every person is always returning, he has a sanity and revelation, which in his passage into new worlds he will carry with him. Never mind the ridicule, never mind the defeat. Up again, old heart.
Hear, hear.
Thank you all so much for coming. I hope you'll join us again next year for this annual Robert Richardson Memorial Lecture honoring the birthday of Ralph Waldo Emerson. Thank you.